And welcome, and thank you for joining us for our incredible seminar today. Today, we have Dr. Asaf Romirowsky and Dr. Alexander Joffe joining us. And I just wanted to point out to you before I introduce them that if you take a look at your seats, we have programs coming up here at the ISGAP Center as well as at universities throughout North America. So please share the programs with your friends. Please let people know that these are happening. It's critical for people to hear about them, and we'd love to have as many people join us as possible. And also please visit our website. So if you want to hear more lectures, everything including this lecture is being videotaped, and we have ISGAP TV on the website, and you can listen to all the lectures, and some, as somebody pointed out to me, soon we'll have them in podcast as well. So please visit our website. Dr. Asaf Romirowsky is the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. Trained as a Middle East historian, he holds a PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London in the UK, and has published widely on various aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict and American foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as on Israeli and Zionist history. Dr. Alexander Joffe is the Shulman Ginsburg Fellow at the Middle East Forum. Dr. Joffe is a writer on Israel and Jewish affairs. He's trained as an archaeologist and historian. He holds a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of Arizona, and has participated and directed archaeological research in Israel, Jordan, Greece, and the United States. He has taught at Pennsylvania State University and the State University of New York, and has published over 150 scholarly articles and reviews on archaeology, ancient and modern history, political science, environmental studies, and cultural affairs. Romirowsky and Joffe are co-authors of Religion, Politics, and the Origins of Palestinian Refugee Relief. And I understand today they'll be speaking as sort of a tag team. So I welcome them, and thank you so much for being here, and enjoy.
Thanks for having us. We want to talk about this new book, but I want to frame it a little bit more broadly. The study is about the role of the American Friends Service Committee in 1949 and 1950 in organizing and providing relief to Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip. And this is a historically an interesting and mostly untold story, but it has broader ramifications that I think will be interesting to ISGAP members, the ISGAP constituency, because it talks to the role of religion and also anti-Semitism in the development of American foreign policy and international affairs in that period and today. The American Friends Service Committee and the United Nations program that it was participating in are the precursors to UNRWA, the United Nations program that has since 1950 provided relief and much more to Palestinian refugees. And the AFSC's experience is about lessons not learned. And finally, the AFSC today has a leading role in the BDS movement, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement in the United States. And the question of anti-Semitism and influencing, shaping BDS is extremely important. So these are some of the issues that we want to touch on this morning, and why it matters for the question of anti-Semitism as a whole. So we'll do a tag team thing. It's great. So we'll keep it a little bit loose.
So, as Alex mentioned, I mean, really, the story is a unique story that really we think is the footprint for learning about UN Workers Relief Agency, which is UNRWA today, devoted to Palestinian refugees. And part of what was unique about the Gaza mission and the story that led to the Quaker involvement in the Middle East to begin with was originally from a ideologically pacifist, euphoric idea of trying to help the Arab Palestinians in the area as a result of what was happening in the world. Historically speaking, the Quakers got their mandate from Eleanor Roosevelt. The Quakers were utilized in the DP camps in the aftermath of World War II. So to have the opportunity, and when they received the opportunity to deal with the Arabs of Palestine, it was too attractive an offer not to get involved. And what we detail in the story is really their interactions and their personal interactions with the Egyptians and with the Arab population itself. It was uniquely interesting to see the base of operations of the Quakers is Philadelphia, my hometown, and to kind of see the back and forth, the connection between Philadelphia, Lebanon, Beirut in particular, where the base was out of, into Gaza, and really these interactions and the problems that they came across during the course of their work. Interestingly enough, and I think which really one of the more critical aspects for us today, if we students of history, and why it's so critical, obviously, as Alex mentioned, to the ISGAP constituency, is to kind of figure out what the Quakers learned and what they did really come to the conclusion of why they left the Middle East. The project itself was an 18-month project in Gaza. And what was interesting about the Quakers in their entire understanding, which was Quakerism, for those of you who are not aware, is less about worshiping than it's more about doing. And part of the doing aspect, the Quakerly way, was helping people reach a level of sustainability, ability to rehabilitate themselves, and to actually get to a point where they can become, self-sustained. This was actually American foreign policy in the Middle East in the 50s and 60s. Reintegration, rehabilitation, and resettlement. And the Quakers actually came with that understanding that they could help solve the problem of the Arab Palestinians and to actually become fully sustainable. What happened was, and what's interesting about this entire interaction, that they've come to the conclusion at the end when the UN steps in the 1950s, is that there was no real interest to actually resolve the problem. And they come to the conclusion that the United Nations is a bureaucracy that's not going to solve the problem and actually is going to maintain these refugees in their current status. As a result of that, that was the impetus for the Quakers actually leaving the Middle East. And one can make, and one should be making, the real understanding that had UNRWA learned from the Quakers anything, they could have learned that the bureaucracy is going to perpetuate the problem and not resolve the problem. And that was one of the few things that I think that, with all the politics and religiosity involved, from a policy standpoint, that the Quakers understood that there's not going to be a resolution to the problem, even though they tried very hard, but actually a perpetuation of the problem that leads to UNRWA's problems today.
It's important to emphasize that Quakers and Quakerism is a Protestant, a deviant Protestant sect from the 18th century. It's one of the historic peace churches in the United States. They were persecuted in England, came to the United States, settled primarily in Pennsylvania, and the influence on American society and American culture is really quite significant and often understated or underappreciated. They created a network of educational institutions, of charitable institutions, and the ideology of charity, the ideology of giving people skills, was extremely important to Quakerism throughout. But they're also pacifists, and they're also the smallest American Protestant sect. historically, and even, I think probably today, all of Protestantism in the United States is very much smaller. So if we're to try and understand where Quakerism fits into the American Protestant landscape, particularly with respect to anti-Semitism, which shaped their relationship with Israel, and prior to that, shaped their relationship with Jews, and which shapes their relationship with Jews and with BDS today. Quakers believe in the divinity of Jesus, but they don't have an organized church. They don't have an organized ritual set. It's a series of sort of practices, but there's no liturgy and there's no hierarchy. The American Friends Service Committee, which has emerged in the last century as the closest thing to a kind of church that Quakers have, only goes back to 1917 and the American involvement in World War I. Prior to that, Quakers, during World War I, Quakers were actually imprisoned because they refused to serve in the U.S. military. And the service committee was constructed by a series of Philadelphia Quaker leaders as a means to provide alternate service. They ran ambulance services, they dealt with refugees, and at the end of World War I, they were operating really worldwide, and they became, in effect, both an early non-governmental organization that had, by the 30s and certainly by the 40s, an enormous reputation and enormous influence. But they were never a church. Quakerism then and is still today organized around local meetings. There's a meeting in this town and that town, and so on, as are Mennonites and other groups, other peace churches. But the role of the AFSC is unique in that, coming out of World War II, when they were active both during and after the war, particularly in Europe, dealing with millions of displaced persons, they were active in Asia, also in South America. They had an enormous reputation as effective, non-partisan, non-political deliverers of aid and deliverers of skills. And their emphasis was skills. They were, unlike other Protestant sects, their orientation was absolutely not towards missionizing. Now, having said that, like all other Protestant sects, they were very active in the Middle East, creating institutions going back to the beginning of the 19th century, first half of the 19th century, creating schools and hospitals in particular. But they were very unsuccessful converting anyone to Quakerism. And in general, Protestant missionaries in the Middle East were extremely unsuccessful converting anybody to Protestantism, except for Eastern Christians, who found it advantageous to become Protestants, as opposed to, because that put them under the aegis of Western powers, Britain, France, Germany, and Russia in particular. No, not Russia, sorry. It's Orthodox Church. But, so the Quakers are an anomaly in that respect. They're non-political, they're non-missionizing. And that gave them a great deal of a relationship with Jews, because they were very active in Europe in the DP camps, as Asaf said, after the war. And they were very active in the United States as well, in Appalachia in the 1930s. But in 1947, they win the Nobel Prize, the AFSC and their British counterparts, British Society of Friends. And that raises the bar for them. And it begins a process of one might say, the AFSC becoming something like a church or a mothership for the Quaker movement in America. And it begins the process of converting the Quakers to what they are today, which is, on the one hand, a very small, very conventional Protestant sect that is outwardly much more like, or ideologically, much more like other Protestant sects, and also converting this to become a conventional left-wing pressure group. And so in 1947, they win the Nobel Prize, and this sucks them into, on the one hand, the Gaza Relief Project, by means of what they call religious diplomacy, trying to negotiate a ceasefire in Jerusalem, sending a somewhat misguided mission to see the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, then resident in Cairo, to try and find an ecumenical common ground for between Muslims and Christians. In a sense, it's a kind of very early Abrahamic religions ideology, the idea of Abrahamic religions that we all share Father Abraham and therefore have some sort of religious and moral ideological commonality has very much become a thing in the last generation or so. Not necessarily with a strong foundation, factual foundation. But the other thing they became involved with in the aftermath of World War II and in the aftermath of their Nobel Prize in 1947 is the Cold War and the cause of disarmament. This is a very important part of the story. They thought, their leaders thought, and that by that I mean the leaders of the AFSC. Again, it's not a church. They don't have a hierarchy of bishops and archbishops and popes and whatnot. They have lay leaders in Philadelphia who decided that the Cold War was so important and so dangerous and so threatening to the planet that they had to put aside their tradition of political neutrality and advocate for peaceful relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, then the U.S. and China, and nuclear disarmament. And these different strands in their practice, in their ideology, pacifism becoming disarmament, becoming a kind of left-wing ideology, a long and very distinguished tradition of relief work around the world, really coming to an end in Gaza when they encountered the Palestinian issue. And the tradition of the AFSC as, the emerging tradition of the AFSC as a kind of mothership for Quakers. And from the 1950s onward, the causes of disarmament, the causes of the Cold War became their central focal points. And have shaped, and which by the 1960s, turned the AFSC into a very conventional pacifist organization that was adamantly opposed to the Vietnam War, adamantly opposed to the American role in the world generally, overall favorably inclined towards the Soviet Union and towards the People's Republic of China, which set them up for 1967, when the world changed and their world, the world of Quakers and the AFSC, changed yet again. So, about that, those fun times.
Those fun times. Well, just one more point to go back to, I think, which is also valuable to understand. I mean, the aspect of religious diplomacy, which has really become their frontier agenda, and really related to their anti-Semitism that played out within this dynamic itself. So the pacifism is also what led them to believe in disarmament at large, to the neutrality that they had or believed that they have when it comes to the Middle East at large. I mean, there was a proposal made even early on that the Quakers would actually govern, and there would be a Quaker mayor of Jerusalem as a result of the fact that the three monotheistic religions should be governed by pacifism and because they know how to deal with it. What Alex mentioned, earlier about the Mufti is very critical. It was the first time that the Quakers came to the realization that some Muslim leaders are really, and specifically the Mufti, were not sincere about their religiosity, but their political ideologues, and there was no room for compromise. So the whole idea of religious diplomacy playing out within their mentality, and the fact that they could govern Jerusalem and the center of all these issues, they left very disillusioned when they met with the Mufti, and they came to really a realization that they had, this was not going to work out in the way they wanted it to work out.
Now, let me just interject one thing, an amusing, actually a quite horrifying anecdote. They came away from this interview with the Mufti kind of down, crestfallen a little bit. In 1940, their leaders had an interview with Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich's main security office in Berlin. And they came out of that meeting thinking that they had softened the hearts of their Nazi counterparts. So strong was their tradition of being non-political, and so strong was their confidence in themselves at that point, that they could go and talk to Nazis. Now, it speaks something about their cachet, that they could even get in the door to talk to a Nazi like Heydrich. And it speaks to their neutrality, that they continued to do work with Jews and others in France right up until 1941, and in Spain later on. But it's a funny sort of mentality. And when they began to hit the wall in 1949 and 1950 and encounter things that they had never encountered before, like the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and then the actual refugee experience in Gaza, where they encountered refugees the likes of which they had never seen before anywhere. This was frankly a shock to them.
And really, that's really it was more the correlation of religiosity and politics, which we all know very much embedded within the Arab-Palestinian narrative, is exactly the point that Alex is making, which is really the shocker of how to even deal with the Arab population. I mean, this was where they, for example, encountered and really the colorful interactions between Gaza and Philadelphia about the double counting of Palestinians, the inflation of numbers, the lying. I mean, this was all part of something they were trying to figure out how we can deal with this and work within what they defined as normal Quaker clients, more or less, when you're looking at what they had to deal with in Europe, and here they are dealing with this newfound environment. It's also interesting not to think on exactly this time in the 40s and 50s about Jewish involvement. The Quakers also had some Jews involved with them, sponsored by the Ford Foundation. And actually, the Ford Foundation is actually, if you fast forward to the environment today, obviously is one of the helping support some of the BDS activity vis-a-vis the Quakers today. But it started back then, and namely individuals, who are at the time people like Don Peretz, who was now in his late 90s, was a professor at Binghamton for many, many years. Peretz was on a grant of the Ford Foundation working for the Quakers, was acting as a journalist, and actually was smuggled out of the Siege of Jerusalem and reporting for the Quakers and writing pieces about the Quakers and Quakers initiatives. It was interesting that even in those interactions between the Quakers and Jews, and Peretz as a liberal Zionist individual were seen as a threat. We've come across in comments about the fact, well, he's too Zionist, he can't be pacifist, he can't be neutral in this mentality. That perspective was also the preamble for their understanding of how to deal with the Israeli government. Most of the interactions, while they were able to get in the door with Nazis like Heydrich and the Grand Mufti, they were also able to get in the door with people like David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharet. And Sharet, who was in charge at the time of Arab affairs, took many meetings with the Quakers, including Ben-Gurion himself. The Quakers were actually responsible for proposing some proposals for resolution for the Quakers, for the Palestinians. There was already agreement in 1951, in the 1950 and early 50s, brokered by the Quakers, where they were trying to, where the number on the negotiating table was close to 350,000 of the original refugees of 1948, 1949, depending on how, looking at the numbers of the aftermath of 48, 49, we're talking about close to 700,000. The numbers, 15% vary between Benny Morris and Ephraim Karsh. But as far as the numbers go, the proposal itself was to take in that number. The only caveat was to accept Israel's right to exist in peace. And again, when the Arab world and the Palestinians rejected those offers, again, was another sign for the Quakers how this is not going to move along. We are not going to be able to influence the way we want to influence, and as much as, and they came across the same ideology that has moved them along.
It was something that they had never encountered before. They never had encountered refugees who wanted to stay refugees. And this was profoundly confusing and disturbing to them. They had by that time 35 years, say, of experience with various refugees from around the world. And their orientation was, you give them skills, you give them education, you give them medical backup, you give them what relief aid is necessary, and then they go on their way, and you go on their way. Everything is the relationship is limited, and the Quakerly way is a sense of human dignity demands that the refugees themselves get back on their feet and resume their lives. This was not the approach that the refugees themselves wanted to take. And there's a wonderful, there are all sorts of exchanges between the Gaza field personnel for the AFSC and the Home Office. And with they're talking to the UN and they're talking to the State Department. So there's this one exchange in 1949 where one of the AFSC personnel is reporting back to the Home Office saying there was a protest when a UN official came and the Palestinians were holding up signs saying, send us back home, compensate us, maintain us until we are refreshed. And I think this is marvelous because I think that really captures the essence of the ideology, Palestinian refugee ideology, that had been fully formed in 1949. And arguably, things are not a whole lot different today. The AFSC, the UN, the international community was then caught in between all the Israel, obviously, and the Arab states. The Arab states were very happy to consider accepting more and more and more development aid for their underdeveloped countries, which the U.S. was beginning to propose starting in 1950. A sort of extension or based on the idea of the Marshall Plan, that raising everyone's boats around the world, not only in the Middle East, but in Asia and South America, would encourage Arab countries to resettle Palestinians. And the Arab countries were very happy to take the money, but they were quite adamant about not resettling Palestinians.
And that was, just to add one more point there, is exactly where this is where it feeds in nicely into UNRWA's role at large. When UNRWA takes over the entire mentality and the mentality that is within the Arab world at large, that the refugees are there forever as a symbol of the atrocity of 1948, i.e. the Nakba, and the Nakba mentality should remain the constant theme. I mean, the quote that Alex, colorfully quoted for you, it really is, the ideology was already cemented by 49. It wasn't anything that was going to change. And this was the disillusionment that the Quakers had. I mean, they were actually asked by UNRWA, when UNRWA took over, by the first Secretary General of UNRWA, Kennedy, who was a Canadian, to stick around because they had the fieldwork expertise. You knew the population, you dealt with them, you know exactly what their needs are. And even if there was money on the table and there were different proposals, even though there was never enough resources, they basically said we had enough because they were so fed up with really, everything that they came across with this fermented ideology that existed so much within the Arab Palestinian population that there was no way to change that. And every interaction they've had with the Arab leaders, even with the Egyptians and with others, all came to the conclusion this is going to be going on forever and ever. And in their final words, while they leave, they say that this is going to be a problem that really it has no end. That being said, as we've described historically, as time goes by, it has not stopped them from seeing disarmament and the threat of the Cold War and their involvement in the anti-war movement as part of the flagship of what they do. They also come to the conclusion as we go forward, and by the time we get to the 1960s and the Six-Day War, and then by the time we get to 1973, is that they do start seeing the Palestinian issue as a byproduct of this larger historical environment that's happening around. They're victims of that mentality, and there is what is considered, what we consider to be this kind of replacement theology that exists within this mentality, where the Arab Palestinians becomes the Jew, and you have this kind of flipped narrative of the David and Goliath, even embodied within the Quaker narrative. That is the background there for why they're now getting involved in BDS activity. The actual work itself ended in the 1950s, which was the preamble for their work. Now, since the 60s and onward, we started seeing much more pamphlets coming out about understanding the right of return, the occupation, and this was all done under their view of the world of Cold War threat, disarmament, and whatnot. One of the heads of the Quaker leaders, the lay leaders in Philadelphia, Clarence Pickett, used to be picketing the White House, the anti-war movement, but then would come again to the White House dinners under Kennedy. So you would have that back and forth where he would still be invited again. Speaking to the cachet of the Quakers, allowing them to get in the door into all these places while protesting and pushing the ideology at the same time.
The turning point is really 1967. It's the turning point for many things. The Quakers had been out of the Middle East and really not involved with the issues after 1953. That's when the last Quaker personnel left the region. They sent a few letters to the editor in the intervening years, but they weren't really involved, and they became much more involved with Cold War issues. They were central to the anti-war movement in the 1960s. They actually had they sent medical aid and other aid to North Vietnam, which caused a huge schism within the AFSC itself. Obviously a tumultuous time for American society as a whole. But they put their bets on what you could call a very conventional left-wing approach. Fortunately for them, you might say, 1967 comes along, and their interest in the Middle East is rekindled. And their interest in the Palestinian issue is rekindled. They, as I mentioned earlier, they had built schools in Ramallah and also in Lebanon, going back, I think, in the 1850s. And so they had a small but significant presence in the region and in Jerusalem. After 1967, the region as a whole is really back on everyone's map in a new and more significant way. And in 1967, late 1967, I think, the American Friends Service Committee, for whatever reasons, decides to make the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian issue, a full-time focus and they set up an office in Jerusalem, and they send a full-time person out there for the first time in 15 years. That person immediately starts advocating on behalf of the Palestinians to the extent that she is almost expelled from the country by Israeli security. And it becomes a whole sort of diplomatic to-do. This is the way that they begin to get back into it. The other way that they begin to get back into the issue is that they leverage their tradition of ecumenical relations with Jews, and they start doing programs with American Jews, which are, as one might expect, dramatically one-sided. So Palestinians come in and harangue the audience and the Jews, again, under the aegis of the Quakers and the AFSC. And the American Jews are supposed to sit there and shut up and accept this and not say anything because they can't challenge the Palestinian narrative. Again, it's part of the whole 60s and 70s emergence of narrative and feelings as important considerations for policy, and the emergence of conflict resolution as a separate thing, as an entity, as an ideology, in fact. And this continues throughout the 70s and 80s. But one of the things that this does, because so much material is coming out of the AFSC offices in Jerusalem and in Philadelphia in the later 60s and throughout the 70s, this has an influence on American peace churches and the Friends meetings throughout the country. And it begins to, let's say, convert the Quaker movement towards really a dramatic anti-Israel bias, for one thing. And it begins to inch the movement closer and closer towards traditional Protestant anti-Semitism in the form of replacement theology, sacralizing the Palestinians and their suffering, demonizing the Jews and their oppression. Things that the Quakers had explicitly avoided throughout. During the 1920s and 1930s, these were, of course, very important parts of Anglican theology and Episcopalian theology in the United States. The Anglicans and the Episcopalians had, for one thing, very important infrastructure throughout the Holy Land, and really all around the Middle East, far more extensive than the Quakers ever did. And they saw the emergence of Israel, or Zionism, and then Israel as theologically abhorrent and practically disastrous, because it would undermine everything that they had been doing for, by that time, 150 years.
It's also important to know, just to interject one point, I mean, those same individuals, which talks about really how the same kind of theology and ideology has cascaded. Many of the Quaker field workers and many of the individuals who were former Quakers in the Gaza Project joined the ranks of American academia. They became professors of international relations and conflict of interest. They worked for the State Department. So, I mean, if you talk about the attitudes and the perceptions that existed as a result of taking these same individuals who had this entire experience of field work and knowledge of their clientele, and they bring back the same kind of mentality in academia. And obviously, I'm sure everybody in the room understands what's happening in academia today, specifically in regard to Middle East studies and poli-sci and international relations, that there is this kind of anti-Israel attitude. These individuals came from that mentality. And so their experience there obviously is cascaded going forward. And at the time, obviously, we're talking about the 70s and 80s and the 60s, there was also a much better reciprocity going on between academia and as advisors to American foreign policy makers. And so you think about that reciprocity that existed, that also shaped American foreign policy. And so when you look at that, obviously you're also seeing at the same period of time this hypersensitive focus, specifically post-1967, on how tragic, and again, you know, the aftermath of the Six-Day War, highlighting the victimhood of the Palestinians, the fact that we all need to help the Palestinians. This is all part of where the centrality of the right of return that is embodied within UNRWA today, and UNRWA already in the 60s, take a central point. The Quakers who were involved early on bring that back to the table, and that all ties into the anti-war movement, into the idea, into the view of American foreign policymakers as the centrality of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, specifically the Arab-Israeli conflict at large, but also how the Palestinians are a unique entity. And again, as I mentioned before, the fact that this was the first refugee population they've ever come across that never wanted to leave and wanted to maintain their refugee status has also caused them to believe that they, like UNRWA claims and has claimed when UNRWA was created, as a special group within refugee populations, the Quakers take on and adopt that narrative as well because of their experience. I mean, it's critical to understand how it shaped all of this and why they've been involved in all these activities as we've seen, you know, today.
Right, and today, today the Quakers are very much smaller. I don't know the number of Quakers in America off the top of my head. Very much smaller denomination than they once were. As are all the peace churches, as are all of the Protestant denominations really across the board, the non-evangelical denominations. The hostility towards Israel and theologically towards Jews has increased in the so-called mainstream Protestant denominations tremendously in the last generation. Largely, I think, under the influence of Palestinian Christians who come out of particularly Bethlehem and Nazareth, a series of Protestant institutions there, which had been set up originally by American missionaries however many decades ago, which adopt very doctrinaire sorts of supersessionist beliefs and liberation theology beliefs. So there's a kind of cross-fertilization, you might say, with 1960s Catholic thought, which has then in turn gone back to the the mainstream Protestant denominations in the UK and in the US, which has gone into Quaker ideology as well. And for this reason, we see Quakers adopting BDS as a central activity, and as a central tenet. They ostensibly promote a two-state solution, but the essence of BDS is a one-state solution, a Palestinian-dominated state. The AFSC partners with a variety of organizations, not least of which is Jewish Voice for Peace, in running a BDS summer camp. Is that July? June, July? July. You can join, send your kids, send your grandchildren to that. And the story arc is that the Palestinian refugee issue has returned once again full force in the last 2 or 3 decades to the American Quaker movement. And their small experience, significant, and very positive experience in Gaza, providing relief more effectively than any other organization before or since, far more effectively than contemporary organizations did. The International Red Cross, the League of Red Cross Societies, vastly more efficiently and effectively and honestly than UNRWA has for the last 60 years. But the episode never left them. It was internalized somehow within the DNA of the organization, the issue, and it has helped in some unquantifiable way to engender a great deal of hostility towards Jews and especially towards Israel. And I guess the last question is how much of this qualifies as actual anti-Semitism? When they were in the field in 1949, 1950, there were individuals on their staff who seem to have had questionable beliefs. None of those people are around anymore. Can't really question them directly, but they didn't. Some of them didn't like Jews, whereas some of them really made the effort, so far as we can tell in the documentation, to be fair, to be positive,
To be Quakerly.
And certainly since 1967 and the early 70s, Quaker attitudes have changed. Now, at the same time, it is possible somehow, I don't know how, which is very much a characteristic of American religion as a whole, personal religion, for Jews to be Quakers and for Buddhists to be Quakers. It speaks to the sort of erosion of religion generally in American society, the categories and concepts, and you have this smorgasbord sort of effect.
But that's how they also see JVP as Jewish Quakers. I mean, so that also explains their understanding of Jewish involvement. And to Alex's point, just to interject as well. I mean, those intimate relations in the 50s were more sincere. But the politicization later on, and where we are today, we have seen through history, and we have seen evolution through the documents that we have unearthed. Basically, that today you could call it blatantly more anti-Semitic than it was early on. Whereas early on there was an attempt to become neutral, pacifist, and fair to all. But today we have without a doubt. As Alex mentioned, we know that BDS is anti-Semitic by nature. It has all, while it's being sold as legitimate criticism, it is not. I mean, all the tenets to go exactly with the BDS movement. There is, and even when there has been these queries with the FSA today, there has been why are you supporting BDS despite its nature, they will refer you back to where they were historically. We've always supported peace and peaceful interaction, and as a result of that, that's why we're supporting it, because they see it as a mechanism, again, tying into the kind of anti-war disarmament narrative of putting pressure to resolve conflict. And that's how it's seen and internalized within their circles today when they are supporting such issues, putting out pamphlets about the occupation and the centrality of the right of return. All of that feeds into this internalizing the centrality and the fact that something needs to be done about it, and BDS is the answer if you want to make it done efficiently, effectively, and now, which is really how it's seen.
That's probably as good a place as any to stop and
questions.
see if there are questions.
Yes, ma'am.
So who is actually funding the Quakers? Are they self-funded? And are their programs self-funded with a shrinking Quaker population?
Some of it, the BDS camps, some of it is Ford Foundation money, the connection with the JVP. The way the money is being funneled, it goes through JVP, and they're actually funneled to the AFC as a contractor of this. So we have looked to try to figure out how the kind of tracking of the money on these issues. but a lot of it is Ford Foundation money that used to give in the past and now coming back, private donors, Palestinian sympathizers, there's a lot going on related to that kind of activity. Also, individual donations. I mean, people, who support, who are Quakers, are giving, again, as we've spoken about, that the AFSC itself, these kind of town hall meetings and these committees are the worshiping, and that's the actual worshiping activity in itself. The fact that they can do something about it has also generated monies. Interestingly enough, to that end, because of how they saw the call to action, the severity of things in the Middle East, many of the people early on were business individuals and other people who left their businesses in order to support the Quaker cause because they could do that. And it was the right time, and many of those families still continue to give. In Philadelphia and obviously in Pennsylvania, many of the colleges, which house the archives, from Swarthmore to Bryn Mawr to Haverford, are all Quaker schools. And so they have established large endowments that have been helping support some of these initiatives.
Please.
When the Quakers left Gaza in the 1950s, had they bought into the Palestinian right of return? Because it sounds to me like the fact that they were prepared to leave,
At that point,
they
no.
didn't
No.
quite.
At that point, no. And
How
that's
did that turn?
well, that's an interesting point. When they left, it was a headquarters decision. The field unit in Gaza, which consisted of several dozen individuals, had expressed its sympathies with the Palestinians. It's that they had, to some great extent, adopted the narrative of their charges. And it's interesting that they wrote a letter to the head office saying, we feel strongly about these issues, we sympathize strongly in all these ways, but we feel that we have to go, because we have to leave, because it's not Quakerly to stay and to continue the process of just giving welfare, which would deepen the moral degeneration, is the term that was used, of the Palestinians. This letter was then leaked by the headquarters and showed up in a statement read by the Secretary General of the United Nations. When did they go full-bore right of return? They didn't write about these issues very much in the later 50s and into the 60s. But by the later 60s, and we wrote this thing for it's called The Tower. It's an online magazine. We went through all the different publications. By the later 60s, certainly by the 70s, they had adopted the right of return implicitly, and now it's very much explicit in the last 10 or 20 years.
And that was the turning point, really, 67 on many events, and the fact that many of those individuals came back, when they got involved in academia and others. I mean, that's where the adaptation, really takes full-fledged. But really, when they left, they were mostly left because they felt, as we've mentioned, this disillusionment, it's not going to be resolved, this moral denigration, all of that were symptoms. But the adaptation of the right of return really, takes late 60s, early 70s.
Right. And the whole idea of the right of return among Palestinians has developed and been articulated and re-articulated over the last 60 years, and that's a very interesting kind of separate concept about who's influencing whom and when certain kinds of language is influenced, is implemented along the way. Please.
When the Quakers met with some of the Israeli leaders, how is it that they were never able to understand that there was billions of dollars of world aid coming to the Palestinians?
Well, there wasn't.
There wasn't, at the time it was.
Well, even
No,
since, okay,
no,
but
that's
even
an important,
since
that's an
then.
important point. And that, when they met with Israeli leaders in 1949, 1950, really up till 1953, they had sporadic meetings. The UN's programs for the Palestinians were massively underfunded, and to the tune of, of programs were going to be terminated because they didn't have a few $100,000, and monies were reprogrammed from other UN funds just to keep things going. What we see today, billions of dollars. I mean, UNRWA has $1 billion budget, or thereabouts. That developed over time, and the resources that were available at the very beginning were tiny.
But my question is that, how can the Quakers, or anybody for that matter, perpetuate this whole BDS thing and this whole, squalor refugee situation when they've been given trillions of dollars and it's all being diverted into weapons against Israel? And it's never arrives to lift their status.
That's a symptom of today.
But it's not just today, it's like
not,
at
well,
least 30 years.
The ideology, well, what happened, if you look back, going back to Regina's question, the issue of the money. UNRWA, when UNRWA took over, was created as an Article 22. Article 22 are dependent on voluntary contributions, and also means really not much oversight coming out of the General Assembly, if at all. And so the monies that came into dealing with the Palestinian issue were also predicated on UNRWA taking entire responsibility for the Palestinians. But the Arab world promised them millions of dollars as long as you are the gatekeepers of this problem, and we're going to pay you kind of guilt money. Obviously, they don't want to take them in and accept them as citizens. But we've seen, in the first few years of UNRWA's existence, they tried to maintain some level of neutrality and fairness. But when they realized they're dependent on money, then you see this transition to becoming a full-fledged advocate of the Palestinian cause.
Right. And UNRWA itself runs a relatively efficient operation for what it does. UNRWA itself is not especially corrupt. Monies that go to UNRWA don't get diverted the way the monies that go to the Palestinian Authority do. That's, but UNRWA runs a gigantic series of operations that cost hundreds of millions of dollars a year because they're running schools, they're running hospitals, they're running social welfare networks in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different countries.
My question is, how can they justify this ideology or status as a refugee when they're getting so much money?
Because they're victims.
It's the only population of refugees worldwide that you can be a refugee for life. UNRWA is uniquely defined a refugee from 1946 to 1948 and their descendants. And we have, Alex and I have over the years, we've done a lot of work on UNRWA. We have written and we've shown a slow but gradual expansion of definition. According to Islam, you can religion is defined by the father. There's been a slow expansion to expand to the mother. Basically at the rate we're going, everybody's a Palestinian. And what's happening in the West, and the reason the U.S. funds in the tone of close to $240 million annually without special request, is based on the amount of clientele. If the clientele continues to grow, we're paying more. And so it's the only population where there's an inflation of numbers, rather than a decrease. There have been approximately 145 million refugees since World War II. All have been assimilated with the exception of one population. There was a calculated decision to make that happen. And all of this plays into the narrative and these early NGOs that have been able to maintain them in that position because of the political agenda. Unlike UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which was mandated, even UNRWA in its early mandate, not to get involved in politics, UNRWA today has become a full political advocacy wing for the Palestinians. There has been, I would argue today, that UNRWA today has basically become a shadow government for the Palestinian Authority. There is, all the services that the Palestinian Authority should be doing, you know, they're double dipping. They're getting money for the PA, money for UNRWA. It's all happening, and while UNRWA officials will tell you we were going to leave when there is resolution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they are the gatekeepers of the one thing that perpetuates the conflict. And that all ties in very nicely into that entire model.
But why don't the Quakers accept this, recognize this, acknowledge this, whatever? I think it simply comes down to the fact that the Palestinians are victims. That's the central defining feature of Palestinian people, of their experience. I don't mean to diminish bad things that have happened to the Palestinian people over time, but all of the rest, Palestinian terrorism, Palestinian self-governance or not, Palestinian autonomy, all the kinds of things that Quakers in the 1940s and 50s would have been very concerned about from the point of view of self-sufficiency and dignity and, again, their term, moral degeneration. All of this has been thrown out the window. I think some of it is explicable in terms of the general ideological orientation of the organization since the 50s and certainly since the 60s as a very conventional left-wing point of view. There are victims and there are oppressors. There are good guys and there are bad guys. Westerners are the bad guys. Israelis are Westerners in this scenario. Everybody else really can't do very much wrong, and money and terrorism and all of the facts of the matter don't matter.
Terrorism doesn't matter?
They're all excusable.
No, not at all. I mean, you look at
The Quakers excuse terrorism?
Sure.
Sure,
Well,
yeah.
historically,
Yes.
they don't talk about it a lot today, but back in the 70s and through the 80s, when these were sort of much more front burner issues with the PLO and other Black September and other organizations,
That was all accepted.
you have to understand what their approach, again, as expressed through the publications, and that's the only way we can understand it at the moment. All these years later, their approach is, well, you have to understand the lengths that people will have to go to sometimes to correct injustice. And justice is a very important thing, but justice is an ever malleable kind of concept and construct. And so in the name of justice, people do all sorts of things that may or may not be so good.
But don't they ever examine the way the Palestinians are oppressing themselves by their Hamas leadership and Fatah leadership?
Hamas leadership is the officially elected.
Right, but they're oppressive to their own people.
It's irrelevant to their narrative. It's not, I mean, Hamas has been able to, Hamas today actually steals UNRWA goods that are given for free to the Palestinians and sells them to the Palestinians. So they use it
Again,
as a
this is something that in the Quaker view, so far as we can understand it, again, from reading websites and talking to people, from reading their documents, they may not condone some of these things, but they understand them. These are things that happen because of injustice and oppression. And that covers a lot of sins, please.
Yes, can you give me a citation from an actual Quaker publication which states that the Palestinians want to remain refugees?
They want a publication today or
No,
historically?
a publication at any time that can be cited by me or anyone that the reason that they left originally, or however it's phrased, is because they ran up against a population that desired to remain as refugees, and they had never run up against them before, or anything according to them. similar.
We didn't bring an actual copy of
Our
the
book. Our book has, yes, in our book,
Quaker-
yes, our book.
In the book.
In the book, it
In
has
your
all the
book,
quotes.
there's an actual
Yes.
Quaker
Words to that
footnote?
effect.
Yes, yes. All, in the book itself, if you get a copy of the book, in the documents going, in the original documents going back and forth from Philadelphia to Gaza, those kind of sentiments are all there and those languages there, yes.
Taken from Quaker literature.
Taken from official Quaker AFSC documentations on Quaker letterhead sent from Philadelphia to Gaza.
So
Oh,
why
and-
doesn't that get cited over and over again now by various
Well,
organizations?
Nobody know, this story that we are telling to you today, the Quaker story, is one of the less well-known stories ever told. People know about UNRWA, people know about the Palestinian refugees, and this 18-month project that existed in Gaza, where, you know, which is a small part of history, is not as well known. When we go and we talk about this around the country, and even more so now with our book out, people that even know the Quakers were even involved in the project. And so it's,
But telling this particular story is new and original. We like to think that it is. But at the same time, we hope so. This issue of recognizing that Palestinians historically stated that they wished to remain refugees in the absence of full repatriation to their homes in Israel, there are documents, there are interviews, there are statements to that effect that are all over the
I
place.
don't understand, there's an endless series of Jewish organizations who are consciously trying to get the message out to counteract the fact that Palestinians are victims.
Well, that's,
And none of them utilize this kind of information, which
Well,
would be
But that doesn't
mind-boggling.
stop them from being victims. They're
It
still
doesn't
victims,
stop- yeah.
because they want to
Doesn't-
go back to
No,
what was
no,
their
that's
original
not
home.
true. If you're a victim that wants to remain a victim, then that's part of your problem.
no, if you're a victim who believes that justice will only be served by the full restitution of what you see as, and your allies see as your irrevocable rights, then you are in a special category.
No, if you're a victim that wants to destroy Israel and cites that all the time, then that's a whole different issue, and it should be presented then.
the other part of the issue, which is not widely known and not spoken about, we talk about the resolution for the Arab-Israeli conflict, is the fact that the land issue is secondary to the fact that Palestinian identity is basically synonymous to Palestinian refugees. And many of the groups out there that talk about resolution, there's a greater focus on the land issues than on the identity issues. And to understand the victimhood mentality of the Palestinians, one needs to understand how entangled Palestinian refugees is within Palestinian identity. That is to say, that to say about the Palestinian, you are no longer a Palestinian refugee, meaning you're no longer a Palestinian. And even, remarks that are made today by the PA, going to of latest Mahmoud Abbas, saying, who am I to tell somebody that he does not have a right of return? That was made maybe 3 weeks ago during these negotiations with Kerry. And other comments along those lines are emblematic of that exact sentiment. And the amount of backlash that he got from people who continue to lead organizations in the Arab world promoting the right of return will tell you that time after time. And that is what needs to be understood. And that's what's lacking from the
Your
conversation.
message is very interesting, and it should be proposed or presented as the major message. The Palestinians are not victims, they are aiding themselves in becoming victims. Israel has become the victim of all of this, and that's what should be presented. The
Well,
media and that message is completely wrong, and it keeps getting reproduced over and over again.
Look, if you go back to the 1950s, and you look at arguments about these issues, about who created the Palestinian refugee problem, how many refugees were there, what would be ways to resolve the issue. All of these kinds of discussions were had, and the American Jewish committee was involved, the Israeli diplomatic corps was involved, various commentators were involved, and at a certain level, there is nothing new under the sun. We added in a couple of interesting details, but all of these arguments, all of these issues have been out there since the very beginning, and people unfortunately, hear what they want to hear. And
They hear
the
what the
parameters
media
are,
presents to them and they buy it. That's what they hear.
the media is a separate issue. And why that is the case is very much a separate.
That's what I
A
meant,
separate
Joanne.
issue.
It's not a separate issue.
Yes, sir.
The impression I get, the Quakers were kind of weak on the Soviet Union. So are they the tip of the leftist spear in America on Zionism and Israel? Do
Well, I
they
wouldn't
turn?
I wouldn't call them the tip. Look, they came at it from their religious orientation and their pacifism, and they've moved much more towards a conventional left-wing political orientation, which has anti-Zionism as a central focus, and they've picked up more conventional Protestant anti-Semitism along the way. Where they fit into the constellation of groups and activities is an interesting question. I think arguably they're not all that influential in many respects. They're certainly not as influential as they once were in the 1940s and 50s. They don't have the same following, they don't have the same numbers, they don't launch huge campaigns and get major world religious leaders to sign on, and so on. What they do still is grassroots activities. And through the various meetings spread around the country, to which the AFSC provides materials, they are influential. But charting out the whole constellation of anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and also anti-Semitic groups within the American left and the American right, we would need a very large whiteboard about the size of this wall. And it would be a terrific exercise. That and a couple pots of coffee and some Danish, and we're ready to go. Maybe a martini or two.
At least. Thank you very much.